The slam of the front door was the period at the end of a sentence I never saw coming. One moment, my wife, Chloe, was there, her presence the very architecture of my life. The next, there was only the echo of that final, decisive click and a note on the kitchen counter that said, "I need space, Mark. I'm sorry." The days that followed were a blur of silence and takeout containers. Our suburban home, once filled with the sound of her laughter and the scent of her perfume, felt like a museum dedicated to a failed exhibit. I went through the motions of work, of life, but I was a ghost haunting my own existence. My friends tried to help, but their advice felt like theoretical concepts I couldn't apply. "Give her time," they'd say, or the classic, "Just focus on yourself, man." It all felt hollow. Then the phone rang. It was my mother-in-law, Eleanor. Her voice, usually warm and steady, was laced with a concern that cut through my self-pity. "Mark, honey," she said. "I'm coming to stay for a few days. I've got a key. Don't bother cleaning up." Before I could form a protest, she'd hung up. Eleanor was a force of nature. A widow in her late 60s, she possessed a quiet strength that had always both intimidated and comforted me. The thought of her witnessing my pathetic state was mortifying, but I was too tired to fight it. She arrived on a Tuesday, letting herself in as promised. I was on the couch wearing the same sweatpants I'd had on for 2 days, surrounded by a fortress of self-help books I hadn't read. She didn't say, "You look terrible," though I certainly did. She just put her suitcase down, surveyed the living room with a practiced eye, and said, "Well, this won't do." For the first 24 hours, she was a whirlwind of domestic efficiency. She didn't ask permission. She just acted. She stripped the bed Chloe and I had shared and remade it with fresh linens she'd brought herself. She filled the fridge with real food, vegetables, chicken, eggs, and cleared the counter of pizza boxes. She cleaned not with judgment, but with a kind of fierce, loving purpose. On the second evening, she handed me a plate of roasted chicken and asparagus. "Eat," she commanded, as I ate the first home-cooked meal I'd had in weeks. She finally broached the subject. "She's staying with a friend in Portland," Eleanor said softly, not looking at me, but staring out at the backyard I'd neglected to water. "She's confused, Mark, and she's angry. But this isn't all about you," I scoffed. "It feels pretty about me." "It's about her father," Eleanor continued, her voice gaining a slight tremor. "It's about the way he left and the fear she's carried her whole life that everyone leaves eventually. She's trying to beat you to the punch." The air went out of me. Chloe had rarely spoken about her dad, who had walked out when she was 10. I'd known it was a sore spot, but I'd never connected it to us. To our arguments about work-life balance or my tendency to retreat into silence when stressed. "I wasn't going to leave," I whispered. "I know," Eleanor said, turning to me. Her eyes, the same shade of hazel as Chloe's, were filled with a profound sadness. But fear isn't rational. I spent years blaming myself for my husband's departure, thinking if I'd been more or less, he would have stayed. I don't want that for my daughter. And I don't want you to live with the ghost of my failed marriage either. The next morning, she didn't clean. Instead, she made coffee and sat with me at the kitchen table. "Tell me about the man you were when you first met Chloe," she said. And so I did. I talked about the optimistic, slightly foolish guy who'd started a landscaping business from his truck, who'd work all day in the sun and still have the energy to take Chloe dancing. I talked about our dreams, the house we wanted to fill with kids, the cross-country road trips we planned. "What happened to him?" Eleanor asked, her tone not accusatory but genuinely curious. I looked around the perfectly appointed kitchen, at the expensive, silent television in the living room. "I got responsible," I said, the irony bitter on my tongue. "I built the business into something bigger. I got busy. I stopped dancing." Eleanor reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. Her skin was warm, her grip firm. "Mark, providing for a family is more than a paycheck. A house is just a building. The life inside it is what matters. You stopped tending your own garden." Her words hit me with the force of a physical blow. I had been so focused on building a secure future that I had let the present, the very relationship I was building it for, wither and die. On her last day, Eleanor asked me to drive her to the botanical gardens. We walked in silence for a while, among the blooming flowers and meticulously maintained pathways. We stopped by a pond watching koi fish glide through the water. "I'm not going to tell you what to do," she said finally. "Chloe has her own journey, but you have one too. You can't wait for her to come back to start living again. You have to rebuild your life, not as a placeholder for her return, but as a man who is whole and happy on his own. That's the only man she'd ever want to come back to anyway. She left that afternoon, leaving behind a spotless house, a stocked fridge, and a seismic shift in my perspective. The change wasn't overnight, but Eleanor's visit was the catalyst. I didn't call Chloe. I started tending my own garden, both literally and figuratively. I got back into my own landscaping business, not just as a job, but with the passion I'd once had. I reconnected with friends. I started going to the gym. I even signed up for a stupid swing dancing class. I was learning to live for myself again, not as half of a broken couple, but as a complete person. The ache for Chloe was still there, a constant hum in the background, but it was no longer the only thing defining me. 3 months later, the front door opened again. This time it was Chloe. She stood there hesitant, her eyes taking in the vibrant flower baskets on the porch, the clean, lived-in look of the house. I was in the kitchen, making myself a smoothie, a recipe Eleanor had texted me. We looked at each other, and for the first time in a long time, there was no accusation, just a quiet, painful assessment. "You look good," she said, her voice soft. "So do you," I replied. And she did. There was a new clarity in her eyes. "I saw Mom," she said. She helped me see some things." "She helped me see some things too," I said. We didn't rush into each other's arms. The path forward was still uncertain, a delicate negotiation. But as we sat down at the kitchen table to talk, for the first time in years, it felt like a new beginning. My wife had walked out, but her mother's visit had taught me how to walk forward, and in doing so, had given us both a chance to find our way back, not to the past, but to a new, more honest future. The silence that followed Chloe's return was different from the one that had haunted the house after she left. This wasn't an empty silence. It was a fragile, listening one. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where her mother had held my hand and recalibrated my entire world. The smoothie I'd been making sat forgotten, the blender's motor humming a quiet, anxious tune until I reached over and switched it off. "The house feels different," Chloe finally said, her eyes drifting from the thriving fiddle-leaf fig tree in the corner to the open windows letting in the afternoon light. "I've been airing it out," I replied, the understatement hanging between us. It wasn't just the house I'd been airing out. It was my soul. She nodded, her fingers tracing a pattern on the wooden tabletop. "Mom said you've been landscaping again, actually getting your hands dirty." "It turns out I missed it," I said, a small, genuine smile touching my lips for the first time in her presence. I'd forgotten what it felt like to create something from the soil up. "I started a new project out back, a perennial garden. It's for me." That was the core of what Eleanor had taught me. The life I was rebuilding wasn't a performance for Chloe's eventual return. It was mine. The distinction was everything. Chloe looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw a flicker of the woman I'd fallen in love with, the one who was curious, not defensive. "Tell me about it," she said, so I did. I told her about the struggle with the rocky soil, the satisfaction of building the stone border with my own hands, and the hope I felt planting lavender and coneflowers, knowing they would sleep through the winter and burst forth again in the spring. I didn't talk about us. I talked about me, and for the first time in years she listened to me, not to her fears of who I was becoming. Her stay that first day was brief, just a few hours. She didn't bring a suitcase. It was a visit, not a homecoming. But before she left, she paused at the door. "That dancing class you signed up for," she said, a hesitant smile playing on her lips. "Are you any good?" I let out a short, surprised laugh. "I'm terrible. But I don't mind anymore. It's fun." She nodded, and in that moment, something unclenched between us. "I'd like to hear about it next time." There was a next time. And a time after that. Our interactions became a series of careful, tender explorations. We didn't dive back into the deep end of our marriage. We waded in slowly, testing the water. We went for coffee. We met at a park and walked side by side, talking about everything and nothing. Books we'd read, a documentary she'd seen in Portland, the absurdity of my 2 left feet in dance class. We were rediscovering each other as people, not just as roles we had failed. The distant husband, the runaway wife. Eleanor became our silent, benevolent intermediary. She never pried, but her occasional texts to me, "How's the lavender looking?" or hope you're remembering to eat something besides smoothies, were a steadying presence. She was the bridge, and we were both cautiously crossing it. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday evening. Chloe had come over for dinner, a simple pasta I'd learned to make from one of Eleanor's recipes. We were doing the dishes, a domestic ritual that once felt like a chore but now felt like a privilege. The conversation turned, as it sometimes did, to the past. "I think I was so afraid of turning into my mom," Chloe confessed, her voice barely above a whisper as she handed me a plate to dry. The woman left behind, defined by her loss. I thought if I left first, I could control the narrative. I could be the one who did the leaving, not the one who was left. I set the plate down and turned to her, my heart aching with a newfound understanding. "And I was so afraid of not being a good provider, of failing you, that I buried myself in work. I stopped being your partner and became a businessman. I left you long before you walked out that door." We stood there, in the soft light of the kitchen, the rain pattering against the window, and finally saw the monster we had fought. It wasn't each other. It was our own inherited ghosts, our own unspoken fears. Chloe's eyes welled with tears, but they weren't tears of anger or sadness. They were tears of release. "I'm so sorry, Mark." "I'm sorry too, Chloe. It wasn't a magic fix." But it was the moment the last brick in the wall between us crumbled. A week later, she brought her suitcase. It wasn't a dramatic moment, just a quiet agreement, a shared look that said, "Let's try. Let's really try. Our marriage now is different. It's more honest, more intentional. We have a weekly check-in that sounded ridiculous to me at first, but now is sacred space. We argue sometimes, but we've learned to argue about the real thing, not the symptom. And sometimes on a Friday night, I'll put on some music, and I'll hold out my hand to her in our living room. I'm still terrible, I'll warn her, and she'll smile. That full, radiant smile I fell in love with. And step into my arms. "That's okay," she'll whisper, resting her head on my shoulder. We're both just learning the steps. My wife walked out. But her mother's visit didn't just change my life. It gave us back our lives, separately and together. It taught us that sometimes the most profound love isn't about holding on tightly, but about having the courage to tend your own garden, trusting that if a love is meant to be, it will find a way to grow back, stronger and more beautiful than before.